In terms of consciousness, what we look for when we look at the brain is we look for a neural correlate of consciousness, an NCC, neural correlate of consciousness. A correlate is an item regularly associated with another item. So when you have the one, then you also have the other. They appear together. A neural correlate of consciousness then is neural activity that's regularly associated with conscious processing. Whenever you have conscious processing, you also have this kind of neural activity. So what we're looking for is a kind of neural activity that happens only when you have conscious processing, because if it happens when you have unconscious processing, then it's not a neural correlate. It's not sufficiently correlated with consciousness. You want to find something that only happens when you're conscious in order to try to have a sense of what exactly the brain area is that's responsible for your conscious processing. But it's important to remember that a correlation is not the same as a causation. So even if we could find something that is a really good neural correlate for consciousness, we wouldn't necessarily know that the correlate is causing you to have this consciousness. And that's because there are different possible relations between the brain area and the conscious area, between what's going on with the brain and what's going on with consciousness. So first of all, it could be that the brain activity does cause consciousness. That's one option. But it could be that the consciousness causes the brain activity. So if we've just got an association, we don't know which way the relation is going. Similarly, there could be some third thing that's causing both the brain activity and the consciousness. That's a possibility. It's not clear what that third thing might be, but that's something that we need to keep in mind. And it could be that there's simply an identity, that there's not causation between the brain and consciousness, that the consciousness just is the brain. And so these are all different sorts of relations between the brain activity and the consciousness. So even when we have a neural correlate, we still need to do more work to figure out exactly how they're related. So correlation is not the same as causation. So looking at an example of a neural correlate and how we need to be a little cautious about it in terms of inferring causation, we can think about pain and some of the investigations that have been done in terms of a neural correlate for conscious pain. And here researchers have found that the intensity of pain correlates with the activity in the somatosensory cortex and the cingulate gyrus, the cingulate cortex. So looking at the diagrams, you have, again, the frontal cortex and the occipital cortex, and that line through the middle is the central sulcus. The motor cortex is at the front. That's in the in the frontal lobe, and the somatosensory cortex is behind the central sulcus, and that is in the parietal lobe. So the somatosensory cortex is, as it suggests, soma is body, and sensory is sensation. So body sensations happen in the somatosensory cortex. That they're primarily processed in that area of the brain. So that area is more active when there's more pain. That makes sense. And also the cingulate cortex. So the cingulate cortex, you look on the other diagram, is that gyrus that's subcortical. That's inside the outer layer of the cortex, and that also, the cingulate cortex also fires more with pain. And so, so you have this combination of greater activity in the somatosensory cortex and greater activity in the cingulate cortex, and that correlates with pain processing. The more pain, the more activity. All right, so we've got a correlation between those two things. But as I said before, there are various options in terms of thinking about that relation. It could be that the cortical activity does cause the conscious experience of pain, that the somatosensory cortex activity with cingulate cortex activity does cause pain, or it could be that the conscious feeling of pain causes the cortical activity. It could be there's some third thing that causes both the pain and the cortical activity, or it could be that the conscious pain just is this cortical activity. Maybe when these things are going on, that's just what pain is. So these are different options in terms of thinking about what we learn from the correlation between these particular brain areas and conscious pain. One important way to try to get at the differences between consciousness and unconsciousness is through contrastive analysis. And that is just what it sounds like. You contrast the conscious processes with the unconscious processes, and you analyze what the differences are. So you try to think about what function consciousness is serving in relation to the processes that can go on unconsciously. And this graph gives you a sense of these differences. You don't need to know all of the different four comparisons. It's just to get you started thinking. We'll talk later about the function of consciousness, and this sort of graph will give you more to go on when we're specifically focusing on whether consciousness serves a function, and if so, what that might be. So in thinking about what consciousness seems to do as opposed to unconsciousness, it looks like conscious processes are relatively inefficient. We get lots of errors, it's slow, there's interference, there's a large range of contents that are processed consciously. So, you're experiencing sights and sounds and thoughts all happening at the same time. And that's unified and serial, but limited capacity. You can only process so much at a given, at each moment as you're consciously processing. And they involve, conscious processes involve perceptual contents. There's always something perceptual going on, even if you are closing your eyes and trying to think the most abstract thoughts that you can have, there's still some perceptual aspect to it that's involved in consciousness. In contrast, unconscious processes are quite efficient, especially in routine tasks, but they're not so good in trying to combine in more complex sorts of tasks. They're distributed in parallel. Processes, unconscious processes, occur in different areas of the brain, and they occur at the same time. So you've got, your visual processing going on and your auditory processing going on at the same time, and those can happen unconsciously and not make it into consciousness. For example, if you're sleeping, this kind of thing can happen. And unconscious processes are involved in all sorts of tasks, so all kinds of things occur unconsciously. And we'll talk more about unconsciousness and these unconscious processes later on in the semester, and contrast them with the conscious processes in more depth. But for right now, just think about this in relation to the neural correlate of consciousness, that generally trying to figure out what processes are conscious and what processes are unconscious is important to developing a neural correlate. We need to think about what the difference is in order to identify what's going on, what brain areas are correlating with consciousness. One experimental methodology that's been used to try to get this kind of contrastive analysis is called binocular rivalry. In binocular rivalry, incompatible stimuli are presented to each eye. So we have a green face and a red house, and in the experimental setup, the one eye only gets the image of the green face, and the other eye only gets the image of the red house. And these are incompatible. The brain cannot handle these different images at the same time. So the consequence is that conscious perception flips between the two stimuli. So you'll have a subjective experience, so people report, of just seeing the green face and then just seeing the red house. And so the subjects of a binocular rivalry experiment, these are, normal people like you and me, with normal visual experience, go in and do this binocular rivalry experiment and can report, now I'm seeing a green face, now I'm seeing a red house, and the neuroscientists can look at what's going on in the brain and they can see, these are the brain areas that are operating when the person is seeing the green face, and these are the brain areas that are operating when they're seeing the red house, and they can look at the difference. And the experiment is particularly good for consciousness because the stimuli are being presented the whole time, and the eyes are processing the stimuli the whole time. All of that stuff is happening throughout the experiment. The only thing that's different is the conscious perception of red house versus green face. So this is all that changes. And so you can try to get a neural correlate just of the conscious aspect without the other processing of face versus house versus red versus green. To give yourself a sense of how this kind of shift works, a Necker cube also gives you a Gestalt shift. So if you look at the little dot in the middle of the cube, eventually there should be a shift either forward or backward. So you'll see the square to the left as forward, and the square going back, or then you'll shift and see the square to the top right as forward, and the cube going down to the left. So this, if you can get the switch, the Gestalt switch, then you'll see the cube switching back and forth. And you can't see it both at the same time. You can see sort of the image all at once, but if you're seeing the cube, you'll see it facing one way and then you'll see it facing another way. And that's an example of this kind of shift. The stimulus is the same the whole time. The image is out there, it's not changing. What's changing is your perception of how that's changing, your conscious perception. And so that's aimed at giving you this contrastive analysis, giving you that sense of what your conscious perception is doing, as opposed to simply processing the color and the shape. You're getting a conscious shift in terms of how you're experiencing this. When you look at the brain, what the neuroscientists find is that cells in V1, and that's your occipital cortex is diagrammed by neuroscientists into different areas. They're described in terms of different areas, just as the whole brain is divided into different functional lobes. Brain areas, specific lobes, are also divided in terms of their functional differences. So V1 is the outer layer of occipital processing, of visual processing. And the cells in V1 fire the same way regardless of conscious image. So your V1 cells are firing exactly the same whether you're reporting being conscious of the green face or conscious of the red house. Cells in V4 also stay the same. That's a little bit dorsal. That's in the spatial location area, that spatial processing also stays the same. What changes in binocular rivalry are the cells in the inferior temporal cortex. So that's a little further along in processing. That's not in the occipital cortex. So the occipital cortex, or visual processing, appears to be the same. What's changing is later processing in the temporal cortex. Inferior temporal is lower temporal. So, what do we infer from this? Is the neural correlate of consciousness the inferior temporal cortex? Have we found the location of consciousness? Well, maybe. It might be a correlate for your report about the switch. That could be what the inferior temporal cortex is indicating. And so we need to look at exactly what it is that is being indicated. And as we talk about the next example in terms of blind sight, we'll get more evidence that maybe the inferior temporal cortex is playing a really interesting role, but we need to coordinate our science about the brain across very different kinds of experimental paradigms to try to get a sense of what's going on when we're talking about conscious processing. So going back to the different responses to the hard problem, the Mysterian would say, well, you're getting information about reporting, you're getting information about what's going on in the brain, but that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about consciousness, because consciousness is separate. The scientist says, this is interesting, we like this. This is a step forward in terms of explaining consciousness. This is useful to explaining consciousness. The eliminativist says that these are simply correlates of processes. These are correlates of reportability. They're of reporting the different stimulus. They're correlates of the color processing. They're correlates of the image processing, that you can identify the different objects, but there's nothing extra that's consciousness. There's just, what you're reporting. That is what the neural correlates are indicating, and nothing in addition to that.